When your clients become your podcast guests. That's what's in store on this episode of Legit Podcast Pro. Welcome to another episode of Legit Podcast Pro. I'm your host, Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and my mission is to help creatives and business minds in the podcasting sphere cover their legal bases and safeguard their creations. In today's episode, I'm shedding light on the legal nuances you might encounter when interviewing individuals there where you have a financial relationship as well. So let's dive in. Earlier today, a fellow podcaster reached out curious about the legalities surrounding interviewing individuals that they have a business relationship with their clients. Let's take a look at what Dave had to say. He said, "Hey, Gordon, hopefully an interesting and useful question for your content and followers. I have just launched myself as a particular kind of consultant, and I want to offer clients the opportunity to come onto my podcast to discuss the situation they were in, the improvements that have been made as a result of working together, and to discuss their business niche, challenges, innovations, developments, and so on. And when introducing them on the podcast, what declarations should I be making to the audience in a subtle but effective manner, and what wording should I use in my episode show notes? Many thanks, Dave." So this is one of those things that seems on its face to be really, really simple, but the devil's in the details. And when you start to dive in and take apart the various scenarios, we have to get into it. So most creators probably wouldn't even think that there's any real need for a kind of declaration or a disclosure. And that is often the case. But there are a couple of things that can change that. So basically, if you are just interviewing a guest to tell their story and there's no financial relationship, it's generally fair game and there's no specific disclosure or anything needed. Hey, this is my guest, here we are. But when the guest is your client, we have some additional wrinkles to think about. If you're in a profession where you owe your clients confidentiality or a duty of loyalty or to avoid conflicts of interest or privacy, then you have to be very careful. That's lawyers and doctors and folks like that. The client might feel very comfortable talking to you even while being recorded and not really realize that they're revealing confidential stuff that they might not want out there. So it's important that you get the client's consent. Use a podcast release form like the one I offer for free at podcastrelease.com. And it's probably a good idea to just let the audience in on the fact that this guest is a client, just simply by saying something like, "John is a client of my consulting practice." And honestly, that's the whole point, isn't it? You're having them on basically to endorse you and your services and to act as a sort of social proof of what you do and the successes you've helped them achieve. So you want to say this, right? But what if part of the relationship, the package of services you're providing, is that a guest appearance on the show is included for the fees that they pay you? In other words, they're paying you to be on your show. That starts to get into an entirely different situation. I sometimes call this pay-to-play podcasting, and there are a number of podcasts out there that do that. And to my view, it's really nothing more than a program-length advertisement for the client or guest. But unlike other kinds of ads, there's not really any signal to the listener like you would see with a normal sponsor message. And there are rules here in the US and many other places that require that any beneficial relationships that tie in to brand mentions, ads, or endorsements have to be disclosed clearly and conspicuously. So let's break it down just a little more to be really clear. They're paying you, at least in part, for having them as a guest. That is a financially beneficial relationship that influences your choice of whom to have on your show. Now, although the Federal Trade Commission here in the US, that's the agency that regulates this kind of stuff, they haven't explicitly addressed this exact scenario, but they have issued a set of endorsement guides that also govern things like affiliate ads. Now, those guidelines call for that clear, conspicuous disclosure, just like if a brand had sent you free product to review or to use. Now, having a guest on your podcast is, at least partly, an endorsement of that guest and of their point of view and their story or their brand or what have you. So your audience, I think, has a right to know why you chose to interview this person. My recommendation for the kind of disclosure you need would be something like this. Hi, and welcome to the Basket Weaving Podcast. This episode is sponsored in part by XYZ Basket Supply, and our guest is John Jingleheimer, president of XYZ. Welcome to the show, John. So that's for the top of the show. And remember, it has to be clear and conspicuous. So it's not enough to just put it in the show notes or just at the opener of the show. At midpoint, you probably want to do it again. Say, our guest is John Jingleheimer, president of XYZ Basket Supply, who are sponsoring this episode. And then right back into your interview. And finally, at the wrap of the interview, say something like, John Jingleheimer, thank you for being with us and for sponsoring this episode. Where can our audience find out more about XYZ Basket Supply? And that's a pretty smooth and comfortable way of doing it. Hey, and speaking of sponsorship, this episode of Legit Podcast Bro is brought to you by me. I'll be holding my free workshop, Business and Legal Fundamentals for Podcast Growth and Profit, in just about a week or so. And registration is at gpf.link/podcastlaw. That's GPF, my initials, Gordon P. Firemark, gpf.link/podcastlaw, and you can register. So to get back to our topic, I think that the question of what should I tell the audience is always a good one to ask. And when in doubt, I would say disclose more rather than less, as long as that's not violating anyone's privacy to do so. So ask yourself, would I, a reasonable audience member, be unhappy if I later found out this information and the podcast host hadn't told me? Or would this information influence the weight I give to the host's recommendation or endorsement? Or would it affect my decision to listen or to buy something from this guest? And if the answer is yes, then I think disclosure is the right thing to do. Now, if you have a question about the business or the law of podcasting, please send it my way. You can comment on the video version of this show or DM me on social media, where I am pretty easy to find. It's G Firemark or Gordon Firemark on all those channels. And that's going to be it for this episode of Legit Podcast Pro. I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and I look forward to speaking to you again very, very soon.